Thomas Blackwood pulled his worn coat tighter as the November wind cut through the Appalachian foothills. The year 1883 was drawing to a close, and winter was announcing itself with particular ferocity. 6 years of drifting since the war had hardened him to discomfort, but even he found himself seeking shelter as the sky darkened with the promise of snow. The abandoned cabin appeared through the trees like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Smoke curled thinly from the chimney, strange for a place that looked otherwise forsaken. Thomas approached cautiously, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip, a habit from years spent moving between mining camps and railroad towns. "Hello," he called, his voice carried away by the wind. No answer came. The door creaked open at his touch. Inside, embers glowed weakly in the hearth, casting long shadows across rough-hewn floors. A table lay overturned, its contents scattered, signs of hasty departure, or something worse. "Anyone here?" Thomas stepped inside, the floorboards protesting beneath his weight. A sound answered him, faint but unmistakable. A whimper, high and thin. Thomas followed it to a corner where a simple wooden crib stood, partially covered by a fallen quilt. Inside lay a baby girl, no more than a few months old, her face red from crying, though she had nearly exhausted herself into silence. Her tiny fists were balled against the cold. "Lord Almighty," Thomas whispered, lifting the child. She was warm, at least, bundled in layers despite the disarray around her. It was then that he noticed the carving. Crude letters etched deeply into the headboard of the crib, WITCH. Thomas ran his fingers over the jagged letters, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the draft seeping through the cabin walls. He had seen superstition do terrible things during his years of wandering. In isolated communities like this, fear could turn neighbors against each other with frightening speed. "What happened to your mama, little one?" he murmured, cradling the infant awkwardly. She quieted somewhat at his touch, her eyes, startlingly blue, regarding him with an intensity that seemed beyond her age. Thomas searched the cabin methodically. A woman's shawl draped over a chair, a Bible on the mantel, open to Exodus, a half-prepared meal abandoned. No blood, no signs of violence, but the absence told its own story. Whoever had been here had left in great haste, taking almost nothing with them, and they had left the child behind. As night fell completely, Thomas built up the fire and fashioned a makeshift bed for the baby, using clean linens he found in a chest. She accepted a mixture of water and the small amount of condensed milk he carried in his provisions. Taking it from a cloth, he dipped carefully into the liquid. "I'll take you to the nearest town tomorrow," he told her as she drifted to sleep. "Find whoever's meant to be looking after you." But even as he said it, Thomas remembered the word carved into the crib and the isolated location of the cabin. He knew how rumors and accusations spread in rural communities. If the mother had been driven out as a witch, what welcome would her child receive? The baby stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand escaping the blanket. Thomas tucked it back gently, surprised at the tenderness the gesture awakened in him. He had not touched another human being with gentleness in years. Snow began to fall outside, thick flakes that quickly blanketed the ground and made the prospect of travel unlikely for at least a day. Thomas settled beside the fire, his mind turning over possibilities. He had been heading west, following rumors of work in the new territories. There was nothing tying him to these mountains. He looked again at the sleeping child. In the morning, he would search more thoroughly for any clue to her identity or family. But as the night deepened around the isolated cabin, Thomas found himself making silent calculations. How much milk he could purchase in the next town, whether his meager savings would stretch to the necessities a baby would need. "Seems we're together for tonight at least, little witch," he whispered, the epithet transformed into something almost affectionate in his gruff voice. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks and covering the path that led to the cabin. By morning, it would be as if no one had ever been there at all. 3 days passed before the snow relented enough for travel. 3 days in which Thomas learned more about caring for an infant than he had ever expected to know. He fashioned diapers from old cloth, warmed milk by the fire, and paced the small cabin with the baby against his shoulder when she woke crying in the night. On the 3rd morning, he bundled her carefully against the cold and set out for the nearest settlement, a small mining town called Coalvale, according to his worn map. The journey was slow, the baby tucked inside his coat, her small weight unfamiliar against his chest. Coalvale appeared through the trees by midday, a collection of wooden structures dominated by the company store and saloon. Thomas hesitated at the edge of town, suddenly unsure. He had planned to inquire about the cabin, about any woman who might have fled recently, perhaps with accusations following her. But now, looking at the hard faces of miners coming off their shift, he reconsidered. The general store seemed the safest option. A bell jingled as he entered, the baby now awake and peering from the folds of his coat. "Help you." The shopkeeper was a thin man with spectacles perched on a sharp nose. "Need supplies," Thomas said, laying coins on the counter. "Milk, if you have it, and whatever else a baby might need." The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose. "That's Abigail Thorne's child you've got there." Thomas went still. "You know this baby?" "Everyone knows the Thorne girl. Kept to herself up in the hills after her husband died. Folks said she was touched." The shopkeeper tapped his temple significantly. "Then when livestock started dying last month, well, they blamed her," Thomas finished. "Committee of Concerned Citizens went up there 4 days ago. Minister led them himself. Meant to drive her out properly, send her back to her people in Tennessee." The man leaned forward. "Where'd you find the child? And where's Abigail?" Thomas felt the baby stir against him. 4 days ago. The same day he had found the cabin. "Cabin was empty when I sought shelter from the storm," he said carefully. "Just the baby there crying. No sign of the mother." The shopkeeper frowned. "Strange. Abigail doted on that child, even if there was something not right about either of them." "Not right." Thomas kept his voice neutral. "Born with a caul over her face. That one was. Bad luck. And those eyes, unsettling, if you ask me. Abigail named her Mercy, though there wasn't much mercy in how she came into this world. Birth killed her father, they say. William took one look at the child and dropped dead of a heart seizure." Thomas thought of the word carved into the crib. "Sounds like nothing more than superstition to me." The shopkeeper's face hardened. "You're not from around here. You don't know how things work in these mountains." "I know enough," Thomas replied, "about how fear makes people act." The bell jingled again as the door opened. A large man in a black coat entered, followed by 2 others. Their conversation died when they saw Thomas and the baby. "That's Thorne's child," one said immediately. The man in the black coat stepped forward. "I'm Reverend Harlow. That child belongs to a woman who fled justice. We've been searching the hills for her." "Found the baby alone," Thomas said. "No sign of the mother for days." The Reverend reached for the child. "We'll take her now. The community will decide what's to be done." Thomas stepped back. "Decide what? She's an innocent baby. Born in sin, marked from birth," Reverend Harlow said firmly. "Her mother consorted with dark forces. The child will be placed with a God-fearing family who can raise her right, if she can be raised right at all." Thomas saw the doubt in the man's eyes, the barely concealed disgust as he looked at the baby. He thought of the abandoned cabin, the hasty departure, the mother who might be dead in the snow for all anyone knew. And he thought of the word carved in accusation, a sentence passed before the child could even speak. "I'm taking her to her mother's people in Tennessee," Thomas heard himself say. "Seems only right." "You have no claim to her," the Reverend insisted. Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Neither do you." A tense silence filled the store. Thomas was acutely aware of how outnumbered he was, of the child who depended entirely on his next decision. "I was heading south anyway," he said, with a calm he didn't feel. "I'll see she gets to her family." The Reverend studied him for a long moment. "What's your interest in this matter, stranger?" Thomas looked down at the baby, at Mercy, her blue eyes watching him with that unnerving intensity. "Just doing what's right," he said quietly. Thomas left Coalvale before dusk, supplies hastily purchased and stuffed into his pack. No one had physically tried to stop him from taking Mercy, but the hostile stares and whispered conversations made it clear that lingering would be dangerous. The Reverend's parting words echoed in his mind. "Her blood will tell, stranger." Mark my words. He had no intention of going to Tennessee. The mention of Mercy's maternal relatives had been a convenient fiction, a way to remove her from immediate danger. Instead, Thomas headed west as originally planned, now burdened with an unexpected companion and the knowledge that looking back was no longer an option. The first week was the hardest. Traveling with an infant transformed every aspect of his journey. Progress was slow, stops frequent, and nights interrupted by Mercy's cries. Thomas learned to distinguish between her sounds, hunger, discomfort, loneliness, and respond accordingly. His hands, once steady with a rifle or mining pick, now felt clumsy as they changed makeshift diapers or prepared formula from the milk and sugar he carefully rationed. They avoided towns when possible, Thomas acutely aware that questions might follow them. When supplies ran low, he would approach isolated farmhouses, offering labor in exchange for necessities. Most farmers' wives were quick to offer advice about the baby, clucking sympathetically over the story Thomas had crafted. A widower taking his daughter to relatives after his wife's passing. "She has her mother's eyes," he would say when they commented on Mercy's startling blue gaze, the lie becoming easier each time he told it. December gave way to January as they moved through Kentucky into Missouri. The winter was brutal, forcing them to seek proper shelter more often than Thomas would have liked. During one particularly severe snowstorm, they spent 3 days in a widow's spare room, Thomas chopping wood and repairing her roof in exchange. "You don't talk to that child enough," the widow observed on their second evening, watching as Thomas fed Mercy in silence. "Babies need words to grow their minds." Thomas had looked up, startled. "Don't know what to say to her." "Anything. Everything. Doesn't matter what, just the sound of your voice." That night, feeling foolish, Thomas began to speak to Mercy as he prepared her for sleep. He told her about the stars visible through the window, about the different trees they had passed that day, about the proper way to build a fire in wet conditions. She watched him solemnly, occasionally making soft sounds as if in response. It became their ritual. Each night, Thomas would tell Mercy about the day's journey, about what lay ahead, about the things he observed. He spoke more words to the infant than he had to any human in years, and though he maintained his silence around others, with Mercy, words began to flow more easily. By February, they had established a routine. Thomas had acquired a sling that allowed him to carry Mercy against his chest while keeping his hands free. She was growing, her features becoming more defined, her expressions more varied. She rarely cried now, seeming to understand the necessity of quiet during their journey. It was near the Mississippi, as they prepared to cross into the Western Territories, that Thomas first noticed they were being followed. Subtle signs at first, display stones at a campsite, the echo of distant hoofbeats, smoke from a fire not their own. Someone was tracking them, maintaining distance, but steadily on their trail. "Seems we've got company, little witch," he murmured to Mercy one evening, using the private nickname he had adopted despite, or perhaps because of, its origins. The word had lost its power to disturb him, transformed into something almost affectionate between them. That night, he changed their routine. Instead of making camp, Thomas continued walking through the darkness, Mercy sleeping soundly against his chest. He forded a stream, doubled back along rocky ground, employed every trick he had learned during the war to confuse their trail. By dawn, he was confident they had lost their pursuer, at least temporarily. But the incident reinforced what he had known since Cold Vale. They would never be entirely safe. Whether it was someone from the town seeking to reclaim Mercy, or simply a drifter who had marked them as vulnerable travelers, the wilderness held dangers beyond harsh weather and scarce food. As the sun rose over the Mississippi, Thomas looked west toward the territories beyond. Settlements there were newer, less established, perhaps less burdened by the kind of superstition that had marked Mercy before she could even speak. A place where they might start fresh, without the word, which carved into their history. "What do you think, Mercy?" he asked softly. "Ready to see what's on the other side of that river?" The baby's hand closed around his finger, her grip surprisingly strong. By late spring of 1884, Thomas and Mercy had reached the Nebraska Territory. The land stretched before them, vast and promising, dotted with new settlements where the railroad was pushing ever westward. Thomas had been drawn to a growing town called Fairfield, where rumors of construction work and good land for homesteading had attracted families looking for fresh starts. The journey had changed them both. Mercy was no longer the helpless infant he had found in that abandoned cabin. At nearly a year old, she was attempting her first wobbly steps, grasping at Thomas's fingers as she navigated the world on unsteady legs. Her vocabulary consisted mainly of babbles, but Thomas could swear she was trying to say his name, her attempts sounding like ta as she reached for him. Thomas himself was hardly recognizable as the solitary drifter who had wandered the Appalachian foothills. His beard was neatly trimmed now, his clothes mended and clean whenever possible. He spoke more, not just to Mercy but to others they encountered, though he remained guarded about their past. "We'll try here," he told Mercy as they approached Fairfield's dusty main street. "Just for a season. See how the land feels." The town was busy with afternoon activity, wagons delivering supplies, children playing between errands, women chatting outside the general store. Thomas adjusted Mercy on his hip, aware of the curious glances they attracted. A single man with a small child was an unusual sight, one that invited questions he wasn't eager to answer. "Help you, stranger?" A gray-haired man stepped from the door of a half-constructed building. "Looking for work," Thomas replied, "and a place to stay." The man studied him, gaze lingering on Mercy. "We need hands for the schoolhouse we're building. Can you handle a saw and hammer?" "Worked carpentry before," Thomas said, which wasn't exactly a lie. He'd picked up enough skills during his travels to be useful. "I'm Samuel Wilson, town council," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "And you are?" "Thomas Blackwood. This is my daughter, Mercy." The word daughter no longer felt strange on his tongue. Somewhere during their months of travel, the fiction had become truth in his mind. She was his to protect, to provide for, to raise as best he could. "Mrs. Cooper runs a boarding house for respectable workers," Samuel said. "She might take you both in, though she's particular about children." "Where's the girl's mother?" "Passed during the winter," Thomas said, the practice story coming easily. "We're making a fresh start." Samuel's face softened. "Sorry to hear it. Tough country for young ones without a mother." Thomas nodded, feeling the familiar twist of guilt at the deception. Yet what alternative was there? The truth would only bring questions he couldn't answer, and might put Mercy at risk. Mrs. Cooper's boarding house stood at the edge of town, a two-story structure with a wide porch and curtained windows. The proprietress was a stern-faced widow who looked Thomas up and down with undisguised suspicion. "I don't usually take children," she said, arms folded across her substantial bosom. "They're noisy and destructive." "Mercy's quiet," Thomas assured her, "and I'll pay extra for any trouble." Mrs. Cooper's expression remained doubtful. "Where's her mother?" "Dead," Thomas said simply. Something in his tone must have conveyed the finality of it, for Mrs. Cooper's face softened slightly. She looked at Mercy, who was watching the exchange with solemn blue eyes. "You got any way to look after her while you're working?" It was a practical question that Thomas hadn't fully considered. During their travels, Mercy had never left his sight. The prospect of separation, even for work hours, created an unexpected tightness in his chest. "I'll figure something," he said. Mrs. Cooper sighed. "My sister Sarah helps with the little ones while parents work. Takes them in her home near the church. She might take yours too, for a fee." That evening, Thomas and Mercy were installed in a small but clean room at the back of the boarding house. As he prepared Mercy for sleep, Thomas found himself speaking about more than just the day's events. "We could stay here a while," he told her as she drifted toward sleep. "Build something permanent, maybe. Would you like that, little witch?" Mercy's only response was to curl her fingers around a lock of his hair, a gesture that had become her habit when tired. The simple trust in the action made Thomas's throat tighten. Outside their window, Fairfield settled into evening quiet. Church bells rang distantly, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Thomas listened, thinking of the Reverend in Colvale, of superstitions and fears that could turn a community against a mother and child. "We'll be careful here," he whispered to Mercy's sleeping form. "But maybe, just maybe, we found somewhere we can belong." Summer faded into autumn, and Thomas found himself settling into a life he had never imagined. The carpentry work on the schoolhouse had led to other jobs, a new addition to the general store, repairs to the church steeple, even talk of helping design the town's first proper bank building. His skills, honed through necessity during years of drifting, were valued here. Mercy thrived in Sarah Cooper's care during the days, playing with the handful of other children while their parents worked. At 18 months old, she was running now, her vocabulary expanding daily. Papa had replaced Ta, the word filling Thomas with a complex emotion he couldn't name each time she said it. They had their own small cabin now, built on a plot of land at the edge of town that Thomas had purchased with his savings. It was simple, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom for Mercy, a porch facing west where they sat in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. "Story, Papa," Mercy would demand, settled on his lap as darkness gathered, and Thomas would tell her tales of brave pioneers, of animals in the woods, of stars, and how to navigate by them. Never fairy tales or anything tinged with magic or superstition. Always practical stories, rooted in the real world he wanted her to understand. He still called her Little Witch sometimes, but only in private, only as an endearment that had lost its original meaning. The word carved into her crib seemed to belong to another lifetime, though Thomas never fully forgot it or the circumstances that had brought Mercy into his care. It was November again, marking 2 years since that snowy night in the Appalachian cabin, when a stranger arrived in Fairfield. Thomas noticed her immediately, a woman traveling alone, asking questions at the general store, her city clothes and careful speech marking her as out of place in the frontier town. 2 days later, she approached him as he worked on the bank building's frame. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice was educated, her manner direct. "I'm Elizabeth Thorne. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Thomas's hammer stilled mid-swing. "Don't know what you mean, ma'am." "I think you do." Her eyes, startlingly blue, held his. "My sister Abigail's daughter, the child you took from Colvale." The world seemed to narrow to this moment, this woman whose eyes were so like Mercy's that Thomas felt a fool for not seeing the connection immediately. "Your sister abandoned her," he said, keeping his voice low though they stood apart from other workers. "Left her alone in that cabin." Elizabeth's face tightened. "Is that what you believe happened?" Abigail would never abandon Mercy. She loved that child more than life. "Then where was she?" "I found the baby alone," the word which carved into her crib. The memory still burned, sharp and clear. Abigail went for help when she heard the committee was coming. She left Mercy hidden, thinking she'd be back before anyone found the cabin. Elizabeth's voice broke slightly. She never returned. They caught her on the path to the neighboring farm. There was a struggle. She fell, or was pushed, down a ravine. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "She's dead." Elizabeth nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of her chin. "It took me nearly 2 years to piece together what happened, to track you here." "I thought I was saving her," Thomas said, the justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. "They would have taken her, raised her with fear and superstition hanging over her." Perhaps. Elizabeth studied him. Or perhaps they would have given her to a proper family, with a mother and father. "Like you." Thomas challenged. "I was in Boston when it happened. I only learned of Abigail's death months later, when my letters went unanswered." Her gaze was unwavering. "I've come to take my niece home." Thomas set down his hammer carefully. "Fairfield is her home now. I'm her family. You're a stranger who took a child that wasn't yours. I've raised her for 2 years. Fed her, clothed her, taught her to walk and talk." Thomas felt a desperate anger rising. "Where were you all that time?" "Searching," Elizabeth said simply. "And now I found her." They stood in silence, the weight of Mercy's future hanging between them. Thomas thought of the cabin he had built with his own hands, the life he had created for them both. He thought of Mercy calling him Papa, of her hand in his as they walked to town, of her sleeping trust. And he thought of the truth. that she had a family, a history, a place in the world that didn't begin with him. "Come to dinner tonight," he said finally. "Meet her. Then we'll talk about what happens next." Elizabeth nodded, a truce of sorts established. As she turned to leave, Thomas called after her. "What was she like? Your sister?" Elizabeth's expression softened for the first time. Stubborn, kind, too trusting for her own good. And she loved that child beyond reason. She hesitated. "Mercy has her eyes." "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "I've always thought they were remarkable." That evening, as he walked home to prepare Mercy for the meeting that might change everything, Thomas found himself speaking to the absent Abigail Thorne. "I did my best," he told the autumn wind. "I kept her safe. I gave her a home." He paused, throat tight. "But I never told her about you. That was wrong, maybe. She should know where she comes from, who she belongs to." The question of where, and to whom, Mercy truly belonged remained unanswered as the sun set over Fairfield, casting long shadows across the land that had almost become home.